Now, Alan Greenspan met Rand in the early 1950s, and he became part of a group surrounding her that was called tongue-in-cheek the Collective. And this was, roughly 8 to 10 young people who met Rand, and the nucleus of the collective was a couple that first met her in California in the early 50s, Nathaniel Branden and Barbara Branden. And they became very devoted to her and students of her thought. And then in New York, they eventually pulled in a group of their friends and relatives who clustered around Rand and became her closest associates. And it's this group that Greenspan was a part of. So I'm going to read you now a section from my book where I talk about the early stages of her relationship with Greenspan. Although Rand disliked him at first, Alan Greenspan soon became one of her favorites. For 10 months he was married to Joan Mitchell, Barbara's closest friend, and through her met Rand a few times. Once their marriage was amicably annulled, the former couple grew closer as friends, and Greenspan began joining Rand's circle on a regular basis. Even Joan's subsequent marriage to Alan Blumenthal, Nathan's cousin, did little to disturb Greenspan or discourage his interest in Rand's group. At early meetings, he was quiet and somber, earning the nickname the Undertaker from Rand. Heavily influenced by logical positivism, Greenspan was unwilling to accept any absolutes. He became legendary for his confession that he might not actually exist. It couldn't be proved. Hearing this, Rand pounced. And by the way, who is making that statement? To Greenspan, it was a deep exchange that shook his relativistic beliefs to the core. By many accounts, Rand excelled at the kind of verbal combat that impressed Greenspan. Hiram Hayden, an editor at Bobbs Merrill and later Random House, marveled at Rand's ability to conquer sophisticated New Yorkers in any argument. Quote, "Many are the people who laughed at my description of her dialectical invincibility, only later to try their hands and join me among the corpses on the Randian battlefield." Rand began with the basics, establishing agreement on primary axioms and principles. She came out on top by showing how her opponent's ideas and beliefs contradicted these foundations. This approach was particularly effective on those who prided themselves on logic and consistency, like Greenspan. He remembered that, quote, "Talking to Rand was like starting a game of chess thinking I was good and suddenly finding myself in checkmate." Greenspan was hooked. So what Rand taught Greenspan and the other members of the collective was her philosophy of objectivism. And she developed this philosophy during the writing of her third novel, Atlas Shrugged, which would be her last novel. And the idea of individualism, which had been forefront in the beginning of her career, remained important to her, but there's a shift that I trace in the book, in her thought towards more of an interest in rationality and reason. And so objectivism is a complex philosophy. I will summarize it as quickly as I can by pointing to 4 facets of it. Objectivism holds there is a knowable objective reality, hence its name. It holds reason to be an absolute, mankind's only guide to action. It elevates selfishness to a virtue, and it holds that laissez-faire capitalism is the most moral and practical social and economic system. And as I said, these ideas were articulated most fully in Atlas Shrugged, Rand's third novel and her largest. It's over 1,000-page long. Now, like all authors, Rand had high hopes for Atlas Shrugged. It was her opus, her masterpiece, the culmination of years of work. And these high hopes were destined to be dashed when Atlas Shrugged was published. I will read now an excerpt describing the publication and reception of the book in 1957. When The Fountainhead was published, Rand was an obscure author unknown to the literary world. By contrast, legions awaited Atlas Shrugged. Buzz had been building about the book. The Fountainhead's astounding sales, still strong a decade after publication, seemed to guarantee that her next work would become a blockbuster. Rand herself was becoming a mythological figure in New York, a vivid and memorable character rarely seen by those outside the collective. Random House fed the beast with a series of teaser ads, a press conference, and a prominent window display on Madison Avenue. The word was out. A major new novel was on the way. Rand and the collective, too, were breathless with anticipation. Rand told her followers she would face criticism. She steeled herself for attack. The collective did not take her warning seriously. Carried away by the power of Rand's words, they were convinced it would only be a matter of years before objectivism conquered the world. Robert Hesson, a new member of Rand's circle, remembered the feeling. Quote, "We were the wave of the future. Objectivism would sweep everything in its path." Close quote. With such a buildup, Rand and those closest to her were utterly unprepared for the fierce condemnation that greeted the book. "Is it a novel? Is it a nightmare?" Time magazine asked in a typically snide review. A few right-leaning magazines and newspapers praised Atlas Shrugged, but as taken as a whole, the harsh verdict was clear. Rand was shattered. More than anything else, she wanted a defender, an intellectual equal who would trumpet her accomplishment to the world. None appeared. As it turned out, there was not one Atlas Shrugged, but many. Hostile critics focused relentlessly on Rand's treatment of human relationships, her anger, her bitterness. Business owners and capitalists saw instead her celebration of industry, her appreciation for hard work and craftsmanship, her insight into the dynamics of free markets. Students and younger readers thrilled to her heroic characters and were overjoyed to find the comprehensive and consistent philosophy of objectivism. The aftermath of the book's publication taught Rand that she was truly on her own. Her path to intellectual prominence would not be typical, conventional, or easy. In retrospect, it seems obvious. Rand would do it her way. So, despite this almost uniformly negative critical reception, Atlas Shrugged became almost immediately a bestseller. And it was really Atlas Shrugged that launched Rand as the leader of a movement, philosophical, political, intellectual movement called objectivism. And objectivism was promoted during the 1960s primarily by the Nathaniel Branden Institute. This was an organization started by her most avid student, Nathaniel Branden, and during the 1960s, the Institute trained thousands of students in hundreds of countries. They would sell tapes of lectures on Rand's philosophy, and it was the Institute that really sort of created it into a movement. But also Rand had her own her own newsletter, which at its height had 20,000 subscribers. Throughout the 60s, she published a steady stream of nonfiction elaborating the ideas in her fiction books. Every one of her nonfiction books would immediately sell, hundreds of thousands of copies. And she really was able to create her own world and her own subculture, and this was politically particularly important to those on the political right, and especially young student conservatives. She was extremely popular with them.